Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Thumbs up if anyone would like to say hello in the chat box. Selena, are we good to go? Yes, I hope so. All good, right, fantastic. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. And if we could just share the PowerPoint at the beginning, that would be a fantastic start, please. Thank you very much. There we go. Fantastic. Well, what are we talking about today? We are talking about Tempranillo. That's a close-up shot of Tempranillo. I wish I'd taken it. I didn't. It's a photographer in Roberto Del Duero, and it doesn't really tell you very much. I just thought it was a nice picture. And there aren't that many pictures today. There's going to be one map, and I'm going to keep the PowerPoint really to a minimum, that we're really going to focus on the wines, and I'll tell you about the wines rather than putting up details about them on the screen, which means you have the joy of, in a minute, staring at me in my office with all the bottles behind me. Bit noisy downstairs today in my kitchen where I usually do my Instagram lives and PowerPoint presentations and tastings indeed, generally. So we're a bit quieter up here, I hope. Anyway, before we start with the 6 wines, and I'll tell you the order when we get to them in which I'd like to taste the wines, I just thought we'd talk a little bit about Tempranillo, this amazing grape variety to start with. I did quite a bit of work yesterday consulting various government websites, and Ethics in London were very helpful at getting me also some up-to-date figures. So I think these figures we have are about as up-to-date as you can be in terms of plantings. Well, Tempranillo obviously is Spain's most planted red grape. Look at that. I mean, it's the 4th, I think, most planted red grape variety in the world. Look at that, over 200,000 hectares basically, out of we're now under 1 million hectares. That Spain has lost quite a few hectares in recent years because of drought or people pulling them out. It's its most famous grape, I would say. I mean, you could make a claim for Garnacha. Some would say that Mencía is as good as those 2 grape varieties, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. But I think that Tempranillo, to all intents and purposes, is Spain's best known grape variety. And you could say it's its best, really. Look at that, 42% of red plantings are 1 grape variety. It's very widely planted. I think the only place it's not planted in is in Asturias in the far north. And La Mancha is the dominant, Castilla-La Mancha is the dominant region, look, with over 71,000 hectares out of that total of 202. I've said it's Spain's Sangiovese, not in terms of the style of the wines in the slightest, but this sort of coverage, if you like. The Sangiovese in Italy is grown pretty much everywhere. It's one of the few grape varieties in Italy that covers the whole country. And the same thing is true, I would say, at Tempranillo. It's Spain's red grape. It's an old variety. We don't really know how old. That's the problem. Did it come with the Phoenicians? Many things did. We don't know, is the honest answer. And in the 13th century, there's a bit of documentation that refers to a set of grape variety called Las Tempranillas, yeah, by this ampelographer Clemente. You know, was that Tempranillo? We don't really know. It was certainly established by the early 19th century as Tempranillo, particularly in Rioja and in Navarra, both of which we're going to see today. And if you read the Jancis and Jose Buemos and Julia Harding book, which is excellent on this, they think that Rioja and Navarra are the likely birthplace of the variety. Historically, and you know, this is in my lifetime, wine writing lifetime, people said there was a Pinot Noir connection. People often talk about the Camino de Santiago, which obviously runs through Navarra and also through Rioja, as being this sort of gateway, if you like, to Spain. And it was a pathway in many ways. In other words, the grape varieties travelled from further north, obviously particularly from France, into Spain and to the west, and also into Portugal. So that was where the Pinot Noir idea came from. That may have had a connection with the monastery of Cito, but that's been shown by DNA profiling to be untrue, in the same way that the link between Riesling and Alvarinho, which is another myth, really, a Santiago de Compostela, a Camino myth, has also been disproven. There is, however, this parent-offspring relationship with Albilla Mayor, and those of you who know a bit about Ribera del Duero will know that it's the only permitted now white grape variety in Ribera. Does that mean that the grape variety, you know, this parent-offspring relationship occurred in Ribera? Was it a natural crossing? Quite possibly. We don't really know. So it's just one of those things that for now is lost in the fog of time, really. A few basic facts and figures Second, it's got this enormous number of synonyms. But I actually looked it up in a book, and globally, and nearly all of these are in Spain, it has 69 global synonyms, and that must be, I would have thought, a record. I can't think of any other grape variety that has that huge number of synonyms. The best known are obviously Centibel, which is what it's called in Castilla-La Mancha, and in Valdepeñas, which is obviously part of Castilla-La Mancha. Ul de Llebre, in the Eye of the Hare in Catalonia, Tinta de Toro, obviously in Toro, Tinto Fino, Tinto or Tinta del País, I've heard both said, in Ribera del Duero. So it's referred to by all these different synonyms, and I think that just shows you how locally established it is in many of these regions, really, that it's had time not only to adapt to to develop its own name. It is a or the main variety in all of those places. If you look at the list, Calatayud, Cigales, Conque de Bárbara, Costas del Segre, La Mancha, Navarra, we're going to see today, Penedès, Ribera del Duero, we're also going to see today, Rioja, obviously, Somontano, Utiel, Requena, Valdepeñas, Vinos de Madrid. It's mostly a Spanish grape. It's one of those grapes. I mentioned Sangiovese earlier. You could also possibly compare it with Nebbiolo, although I think that's maybe a bit extreme in the sense that it doesn't really travel that brilliantly. The main place it travels to, and the proximity and the porousness, if you like, the border in terms of the way grape varieties have moved between the two, is Portugal. And in Portugal, it's obviously called, I spelled Portugal wrong incorrectly, sorry, is called Aragonés. So Aragon, in other words, a grape variety from Aragon. Look at that, 17,000 hectares. And the next after that is Argentina. And the Argentina connection is obviously with Spain. A lot of the immigrants who went to Argentina beginning in about the 1850s through to the 1950s, something like 6.5 million people immigrated from Europe to Argentina, and they took with them wine. Many were from wine regions, and they took grape cuttings or the culture of wine, if you like. In California, Australia, New Zealand, Tempranillo is developing a little bit of a reputation as a global grape, as a really interesting grape, and other people are planting it. There aren't many people, I would say, outside Spain doing a brilliant job. Lots of people doing a good job, but brilliant, maybe not. A few, maybe in Argentina, certainly in Argentina, maybe a couple in Australia. It's also in Switzerland, Malta, Turkey, Italy. There we go. Fourth most planted globally. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Just how its global reach is one thing, but just how much of that is in Spain. And I suppose the thing you could say is that it's a real success story. If you look at the figures back in the 1970s, Garnacha was by far the most planted red grape variety in Spain. And Garnacha, which is in some ways a bit of a sadness, has lost out to Tempranillo for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute, really. But Garnacha is making a bit of a comeback, but a lot of old vine Garnacha, sadly, has been pulled out because it's less productive, really. What are its characteristics? Well, obviously, I'm sure you all know this, that the Spanish word for early is temprano. It buds early and it ripens early. This is obviously a very good thing in areas like Ribera del Duero, which have a short growing season. It's also good in the higher altitude bits of Rioja that we'll discuss today, which are much cooler. And therefore, sometimes people are picking in Navarra, in Rioja into, certainly into late October historically, and even into November, right? That's why you need this early grape variety. The problem with an early ripening grape variety, particularly with climate change, is that as the budding is getting earlier still, you're at the risk of frost. And frost has certainly hit Spain pretty badly in 2017. This year so far, it seems to have escaped, I'm pleased to say, unscathed, although there was some hail last week. It's thick-skinned. If you look at all of these 6 wines today, they've all got good levels of colour. Particularly, I think the higher you are in terms of altitude, and some of these grape varieties, some of these grapes are planted up to 1,000 meters in Ribera del Duero. It's that effect you see in Argentina with Malbec, that the higher that you are, the greater the UV light radiation, basically, and the deeper the color sometimes. It's medium to full-bodied. You do find examples at 11, 12%, but those are unusual these days. Partly because of fashion, but also because of climate change, again, and these warmer vintages that we're seeing. It's surprisingly quite high in pH, and its roots absorb potassium very easily, I'm told, and that's one of the reasons for that. It's good with growers against its success over the last 2 or 3 decades, because it's fertile. You can crop it pretty high, right? And if you're a grower and you're selling your grapes to a big winery in a region, obviously you want to get as much, as big a yields as you can in the vineyard. So that is one of the features, I would say, of Tempranillo. What changed its status really in Rioja in particular in the 1980s was the arrival of irrigation, particularly of drip irrigation, and that made it much easier to grow Tempranillo, which in the hotter bits of Rioja and hotter bits of Spain often needs some irrigation, and that again is one of the reasons why we've seen Garnacha being pulled out. Clones. If you go to Roda, it's really interesting to go there with Agustin Santolaya. He's got this amazing seed bank. It's a kind of little garden of Tempranillo clones. And he reckons he's got 500 morphotypes. I'm reliably informed that's the correct word. But I would say that there's a lot of, there is sort of a degree of massal diversity, if you like, within the vineyards. But a lot of people now are planting with quite high yielding clones. And therefore we're seeing less diversity, I would say, in some styles of Rioja, of Tempranillo, particularly in more basic wines. High yields, the higher yield, the less acidity you have, and it certainly has less than Garnacha. Javier Alsas, many of you will know, who was for a long time the winemaker of Vega Sicilia and Ribera del Duero, now making his own wines in Ribera. And we're going to see one of his wines where he's a consultant today, says this: best variety in the world, only if you have right grapes, yeah, and low yield. So I think the higher you go in yields, the more it loses of its character and its identity. Can it lack structure? Well, I've talked about this thing about surprisingly low acidity, and it's one of the reasons why people historically have blended it with other grapes. And those would be things like Mazuelo, Graciano, Garnacha, Cabernet Sauvignon. All of these are used to blend with Tempranillo. And we're going to see one blend today from Navarra, which will illustrate that fact. Why are people blending it? And the Navarra example we've got from is a slightly warmer bit of Navarra to add a bit more structure to this grape variety. It does have other forms. One is Tempranillo Blanco, which is a mutation and has now been permitted in Rioja since 2008 as a white standalone grape in its own right. And another one wonderfully called Tempranillo Peludo, hairy Tempranillo. Okay, stylistic questions, and these are some of the things we'll talk about today. And do feel free if you're watching to join in and post your comments. And I won't take it personally if you say you do or don't like a wine. I think it's interesting to get some feedback from the people who are watching and live, especially if you're tasting the wines along with me. Stylistically, well, it's capable of producing a wide variety of styles. I mentioned Sangiovese earlier. And I think, again, the comparison is not a bad one. In the Sangiovese makes everything from the most basic red wines of all, virtually in Italy, to some pretty structured wines that age extremely well in places like Montalcino. The same thing here. It is both a workhorse grape and at its best a thoroughbred. We'll talk a little bit about the regions where I think it is, and particularly qualified as a thoroughbred. One question, to oak or not to oak? I think if you ask most consumers about Tempranillo, they would immediately identify it with the flavor of oak, particularly American oak in Rioja and to a lesser degree in Ribera del Duero. Where does the oak come from? What is the age of the barrels? What is the size of the barrels? I was told recently, and I didn't know this, that the 225 litre barrel size, which is mandated in Rioja and indeed in Ribera, if you're going to call your wine Reserva or Gran Reserva, is something that's actually stipulated by Spanish law, really, by the Ministry of Agriculture. So if you want to call your wine Reserva, you have to have 225 litre barrels. It doesn't necessarily have to be of any age or of origin like that, but the size of the barrel is pre-specified, as it were. To blend or not to blend, well, we've talked about this already. Historically, a lot of Tempranillo was field blended. In fact, most grape varieties were field blended. If you look at a wine like Las Peyatas that Telma Rodriguez makes, Bodega Lantiego, I mean, he's got 8, 9, 10 varieties. He's not really sure, and indeed in some respects, he's not even sure what they are. And if you look at Sierra de Cantabria's Mágico, again, it's a multi-grape blend, if you like. Historically, people planted white grapes and red grapes in the same vineyard, and again, that's partly, I think, as an insurance policy against frost and things like that, or a bad fruit set, or botrytis, or mildew, all of these sorts of things, but also to add more complexity. Maria Vargas, many people know, is the wonderful winemaker Marqués de Murieta. She once said to me that Tempranillo on its own lacks layers and can be a bit obvious. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I certainly think it's a great variety that sometimes needs friends. Is it suited to climate change? Well, yes and no. I think that it doesn't like heat. I think that's one of the reasons it hasn't done that well in other countries, particularly in warm areas, is that in heat it tends to lose even more of its acidity. It becomes a bit flabby. It lacks sort of vigor and focus and precision. So it performs better in cooler places. And what we're seeing with climate change in both Rioja and Ribera, the two regions I probably know best for Tempranillo, is that people are going higher. And we're going to see examples of that today. Higher and maybe north-facing in some examples too, just to get greater freshness and coolness into these wines. So is it best on chalky clay soils? I think probably. It's not particularly good on sand. I don't know many examples where it's planted on schist or granite or things like that, but I'm sure there are examples. But a lot of the best examples, certainly in Ribera and in Rioja, tend to be of those two soil types, and often of the two combined, basically. There's a map before we start, and I'm pretty happy that we've hit 15-minute mark. I don't know how good your eyesight is if you see the map, but I'm just going to do a little bit of pointing here. We're going to begin with the two Riojas, and that's obviously where we are in Rioja, and the Rioja Alabasa is this top bit up there with a little tongue of land of Rioja Alta, which pokes up into the middle of it. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the Rioja Baja, or is it's now called Rioja Oriental, Eastern Rioja, is this bit down here, yeah? And that's not really a great area for Tempranillo. A lot of people are planting Tempranillo, but it's really historically been Garnacha country. It's much hotter, it's closer to the Mediterranean. Look, the Mediterranean is here, and the influence in the Rioja Oriental comes from the Mediterranean. In the Rioja Alta and Alabasa, which is what we're going to be talking about today, you've got this influence here from the Bay of Biscay, right? Anybody who's ever sailed on the Bay of Biscay will know that it's wet and cold. Bilbao is not, sadly, known for its wonderful sunshine. So this is, the prevailing weather comes from two sides, really, in Rioja. After that, we're going to go on to two Riberas. This is Roberto Del Duero, and I'll talk a little bit about these two styles of wine and the differences between them when we come on to them. One is a multi-regional blend, and the other comes from the so-called Golden Mile, which is at this end of Ribera, which is the closest bit to Valladolid, and indeed the closest part to Cigales. Cigales is going to be the sixth wine we're going to taste today. I thought I'd put that at the end because it's got the most new oak. It's aged in 100% new oak, and it's quite a powerful wine. Penultimate wine will come from here, from Navarra. Remember what I said earlier about the origins, yeah, of the likely origins of Tempranillo are either these two areas or this one. I mean, to be honest, they're not too far apart, are they? You could see how easily people would be moving between those two, even in the days when they were on horseback or on foot rather than in a car or a tractor. Okay, so just remember the order in which we're going to taste is, first of all, the Abel Mendoza wine, which is called Jararte. Then we're going to stay in Rioja, and we're going to go on to Bodega 202, yeah? Then we're going to move to Roberto Del Duero, and I'm first of all going to taste the Legares wine. Then I'm going to taste we're going to taste the Conde de San Cristobal wine, yeah? Then we are going to move on to the wine from Navarra, from the Ochoa family. And last but not least, we'll end up in Cigales. As I said, somebody's asked me a question about carbonic maceration. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hit you with that right now. So if we'd like to switch off the map, that would be great. And you could now, I hope, all see me and my office. I'll try not to spend too much time spitting it out, because I know that it's not very appealing to watch somebody on a screen spitting into a spittoon. So this is, as if on cue, to answer your question, Robin, this is a carbonic maceration style, okay? And in some ways, people think, oh, carbonic maceration, is that something new? The answer is in Rioja, it's actually extremely old. This is part of a tradition, tradition, and the tradition was really what already existed in Rioja. The French came to Rioja after phylloxera obviously devastated the south of France. A lot of French winemakers in places like Bordeaux were looking for the nearest good wine region that didn't have phylloxera, and they jumped over the border from France into Rioja. And that was really the foundation, if you like, of modern Rioja, was in the 1860s onwards. A lot of the names that are famous today were really established in that time onwards, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, particularly in the area around the station in Aro. But before that, there was already a tradition that the Bordelais found when they came there. And the tradition was very much a grower-focused tradition. And these growers were producing wine very often for their own family, their immediate friends, possibly selling it to some local bars and restaurants and things like that. But it was very much a localized tradition. And they were using carbonic maceration. Partly out of necessity. In those days, people didn't really destem, didn't have crusher destemmers, certainly not automatic ones, so everything went into the tank. And if you visit a place like Samaniego in Rioja Alabasa, there is still something called a Barrio de las Bodegas, and if you walk around the Barrio de las Bodegas, which is now abandoned, really, essentially, you can see these old bodegas, these old abandoned bodegas, which would have had a cellar beneath. They'd have had a stone lagar, really, where people did the treading, and that was the cosechero tradition. And I think sometimes in Rioja, when people tell you that Rioja has always been a blend of grapes and of sub-regions, it's actually incorrect. That the tradition in Rioja that predates modern Rioja, like industrial Rioja, if you want to call it that, although I think that's an exaggeration, was very much focused on vineyards. And this wine is from a producer who I think typifies that approach, Mendoza. Abel is one of the great figures of Rioja, and an extremely inspirational figure who has had enormous influence on the younger generation. He's, I think, 60 this year. And this is a family winery, and he owns the winery with his wife called Maite Fernandez. Maite and Abel, Maite makes the wine. She's a qualified enologist. Abel is very much a viticulturist, and he's got dozens of different parcels. I've had some wonderful times with him, but he's a great guy to go visiting vineyards with. I mean, also, if you want to brush up on your Spanish swear words, Abel is a great source of those too. If you taste with them, which you often do in their kitchen, he's got a little thing on the wall which says, "Bury me with my tractor." Abel is Mr. Vineyards, and if you were to transport him to Burgundy, he'd be very much at home in Burgundy. You know, he's a grower. He obviously gets involved in making the wines too with his wife, but very much a grower style. So this is pure carbonic maceration, no oak at all. It's foot trodden. It's joven, yeah. It's a multi-parcel wine. Now, Adel, again, a little bit like these producers in Burgundy, has vineyards in different places. All in what we call the Sonsierra. The Sonsierra means it's under the mountain. The Sonsierra is the Sierra de Cantabria. Sierra de Cantabria is this northern limit of Rioja, which protects it from the inclement weather that comes from the Bay of Biscay. Remember, I talked about, you often, if you drive from Bilbao, you drive towards Aro or Logroño, you go up on the motorway and you go into a dense bank of cloud in the Sierra, and you come over the other side. And you often see in Rioja, if you're sitting there and you're looking up at the Sierra, it's almost like a duvet of cloud just draped over the top. And it very much has an influence on these weather patterns that are coming from the north. So I wanted to start with this wine because it's a pure Tempranillo, yeah? It's a Sonsierra wine, and it combines fruit from Rioja Alta and Alabasa. Remember, I said earlier that many of the best vineyards in Rioja are north of the River Ebro, and the Alabasa is all north of the River Ebro. There's a little tongue of land that pokes up into the middle of the Alabasa, and that is the Rioja Alta, or part of Rioja Alta, and that is where all of Abel's vineyards are. So he has vineyards in La Bastida, he has vineyards in Avalos, and he has vineyards in San Vicente de la Sonsierra, which is where his winery is based. So, I mean, very much a Burgundian approach. If we taste the wine, I mean, he's not frightened of structure, he's not frightened of color. Even though this is a young wine, it's not a simple wine, I would say. It's got structure, it's got acidity, it's certainly got tannins. I mean, I think, would you age that wine? I think you could very easily. And that is his basic quaffing wine, believe it or not. His age extremely well. He's also very thanks to the quality of his white wine. He's an outstanding producer. But I wanted to show you that really just as a set of, as one of our building blocks of what we're going to talk about today. Can you taste chalk? Well, I mean, some people say yes, some people say no. I think you can. I think there's a freshness and a way in which chalk-based wines hit your palate, which is very different from clay-based wines and granite and schist and sand and all these different things. To me, this has a slight chalkiness to it, a little bit of freshness to it. Okay, we have got the technical sheet from Celine, if anybody wants to look at the technical sheet. I do recommend that if you get the chance to go see Abel and Maite, I think anybody watching who doesn't speak Spanish, she speaks some reasonable English, he doesn't speak very much. Great time to go is during harvest, when they produce a series of wines called grano a grano, berry by berry, and they actually pick the berries off by hand, and they all sit there in this enormous party in the entrance to the bodega, which you can see from the streets you drive past, and there's lots of music and great food, and it's a bit of a party, and it's one of the great sights, I think, of Rioja. The second wine we're going to taste, and I think the winemaker Luis is actually watching today. Luis, give us a wave. If you are watching, it's fantastic to see you. This is Bodega Los Mendoza. So. Hi, Luis. Good to see you. Fantastic. If I get anything wrong, then you can tell me. Right. So this is a very young winery. And I think it's to me a very exciting winery. It's one of the most significant wineries that have been created in the last decade in Rioja. It has fantastic vineyards. It's got good, it's boutique in a sense, and it's quite small. It's run from an industrial estate, really, a polígono, just outside La Guardia, and it's making really, really exciting wines. It's owned by an American couple, Francis and Kathleen Rooney, and this is a bit of a love story, really. We've mentioned the Camino de Santiago and how it goes through the middle, not only of Logroño. If you're staying in parts of Logroño and you're sleeping in a hotel and you wake up early, you can actually see pilgrims going past the little backpacks on and the conch shell on the back. Anyway, they did the Camino de Santiago and fell in love with Rioja. Who would not fall in love with Rioja? It is an unbelievable region. It's very beautiful, and those of you watching today who've been there will know what I mean. You've got these two mountain ranges in the north and the south. It's hilly, it's beautiful, it has this varied aspect. Lots of these small villages, winemaking villages, which historically produced very distinctive styles. Remember what I said about the cosechero style, and that was lost for a while, but it's something that's coming back now. This is a Rioja Alabasa wine only. It's made by Luis Güemes, and Luis is, as I said, watching today, and it's lovely to have him here. These guys at Bodega 202, their first vintage was 2015, and their vineyards are between 70 and 100 years old. I mean, it's one of those things in Rioja that I write a lot about South Africa, and South Africa makes an enormous fuss about vineyards that are over 35 years old. A 35-year-old vineyard in Rioja would be considered young. There are some villages, particularly in the south of Rioja Alta, in places like Badaran or Cárdenas, where you're almost falling over 100-year-old vineyards. I mean, partly because people can't or couldn't really be bothered to pull them out. Lots and lots of really, really old vineyards, and that's the case here. What is interesting about this wine is that these are all from higher vineyards, right? They're from El Villar, from Cripan, and Lanciego. These are all at the eastern end of the Rioja Alabasa, so fairly close to Logroño, but as I said, on the northern side of the river. Once you go above about 650 meters in Rioja, historically, you were in very marginal territory. People planted white grapes above the road, and there's a road that runs through the Alabasa and the northern part of the Rioja Alta. You very rarely saw vineyards in the 80s, even in the 90s and 2000s. Now, you're seeing a lot of plantings above the road, and the reason for that, as we discussed earlier, is climate change. I mean, if you think about the fact that I was in Rioja in 2008 during the vintage, it was snowing in the vineyards in San Vicente de la Sonsiera, and that was in October. So it can be a very cold place and a marginal place, particularly if you're in these northern areas, the northwestern corner of the region. That's where we are now. So Elia, Cripan, Lanciego. This is again 100% Tempranillo. It's quite ambitious in the sense that it's aged in 90% new French oak. I think I'm right in saying that Luis varies this depending on the vintage. And this is 2016 vintage. 2016 was what we call an Atlantic vintage. An Atlantic vintage means it's influenced by the Atlantic, obviously, and these vintages tend to be cooler, wetter. 16 is one of those vintages where you really need selection in the vineyard, and I've been to the bodega 2002 or 202, sorry, 202, not 2002, 202, and I've seen them sorting outside the winery. I was there once during vintage, and they select really. So this is very much hands-on. It's small production. It's very boutique, and it's very much from this northerly bit, if you like, of Rioja Alabasa. So right under the Sonsiera, with the influence, even in warmer vintages, of the mountainside. Remember, as I said, that kind of duvet of cloud draping over the top. Well, there's a little bit of that. Luis, as you're watching, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about the winemaking or anything like that. I know that I'm pretty sure you don't do any whole bunch of fermentation, that all of the wine is despaliado, what do we say, destemmed, yeah?
Yeah, destemmed. Yeah, I was going to say that 2016 in particular was a very fresh vintage, and also it was the only vintage where we, in our oldest vineyards, we had to pass by and throw some grape to the soil, just to regulate the yield, and limited to 3,500 kilos per hectare. This is what we're looking for. As you said before, is so important. Combine the low yield with altitude, with a slow ripening of the Tempranillo, so where you can really push it hard and squeeze every milliliter of quality in the wines you're making, with the respect and with the focus of let the terroir talk in the wine, with the purest expression possible.
Wonderful, thank you. I think what's interesting about this wine is that if you show it to some consumers, it's slightly baffling for them, because they're so used to Rioja being soft and sweet and aged in American oak and ready to drink on release, and that would be a sort of Gran Reserva style or a more traditional Reserva style. This is what we call a generico style, generic style. There's nothing generic about the wine in one sense, but they're using the term generico, as many of the best wines in Rioja are. It's called cosecha in Ribera del Duero, basically to avoid the rules, the restrictive rules about the type of oak, or rather particularly the size of oak that you need to use and how long you have to age it for. So it allows you a little bit more freedom. The thing about this wine is it's actually made to age. I mean, I think it's way from being ready to drink. You know, I think that this is a minimum 10-year wine. Yes, you can drink it now, but I think that this is a wine with structure, freshness, and a lot of the wines that in my Rioja report and my Ribera report that I like have structure and they're ambitious. I think that they have the quality and the concentration to age, but with freshness. I think the freshness is maintained in this wine. Moving on to Ribera del Duero, very different style region. I mean, some people talk in Ribera del Duero about Atlantic vintages and Mediterranean vintages, but we're way further south. You know, we're an hour and a half's drive, really, or an hour and 20 minutes drive south of Rioja towards Madrid, and it's a much more continental climate. Vineyards are, as a general rule, much higher. I mean, a low vineyard in Ribera would be sort of 760 meters, which is close to the river. Remember, 760 meters in Rioja is still comparatively high. There are vineyards at 800, even 850, even 900 meters for white grapes. But you're not going to find vineyards yet in Rioja at 1,000 meters, whereas you can in Ribera del Duero. It's a continental climate. It has a very, very short growing season. I think I'm right in saying it's the shortest growing season in Europe. It's a very, very extreme place. It's part of the central Spanish plain, which is called the meseta, the plateau, really, rather than a plain. The central Spanish plateau, the meseta. And somebody once joked about it and said that it's 3 months of winter and 9 months of hell. So it's very cold winters, but very, very hot summers. And so what's important here in this wines, or in these Riberas, we'll see the best Riberas, I think, is diurnal variation. So yes, you use very hot days, particularly in summer, but the temperature always drops at night. And if you visit Ribera, you often find that. You know, you can be walking around in the day in a t-shirt and shorts, and at night, oh, you know, where did I put my jumper? Because you know, and that's what retains acidity in these wines. Again, remember, we're at these higher altitudes, and therefore you often get deeper color. The Ribera is often more structured than Rioja. Rioja is lighter in alcohol. Ribera tends to be a little denser, more compact. Wood usage, again, it varies between the two you know, between different producers, really. This is a really interesting wine, and again, it's illustrative of climate change, really. This is called Paramos. Paramo in Ribera, land. It's basically, it's the area above the vineyards. It's the flat stuff. Once you get up onto the high, you go up the slope and you get to these flat vineyards on the top. And historically, these areas were used to grow cereal crops, really. They were considered too cold for vineyards. And a few pioneers have started doing this in the last 20 years. And the first of those pioneers, when they were planting grapes up there, were considered either eccentric or mad. People said, basically, you'll never get grapes ripe up there. But remember, partly that frost, that cold air goes downwards, and you often find that the vineyards at the bottom of the slope were hit by frost, whereas these high vineyards were not necessarily hit by frost. And again, with climate change, we're finding that they're much more consistent from vintage to vintage. So this wine is actually called Paramos, not Paramo, but Paramos. In other words, there's more than one. Yeah, I'll tell you a bit more about where it comes from in a second, but this is part of Codogniu, the Raventós Codogniu group, who are obviously a cava producer primarily over in Catalonia, but they've been in Ribera del Duero since 1999. They own 93 hectares of their own vineyards. They also buy grapes, and I'm pretty sure that most of this is made with purchased grapes from high vineyards in three places: Pesquera, 900 meters, Peñafiel, 900 meters. Both of these are in the province of Valladolid. And Moradillo de Roa. Moradillo de Roa is an exciting new area. It's on the south side of the river. It's at 950 meters. It's in Burgos, which is the central chunk of Ribera, where most of the best vineyards are, I would say, and the dominant wine styles come from there. And it's sort of flattish, but also with a little bit of north-facing aspect. So these Paramos vineyards, it's a blend of the three, and they're all at high altitude, and they're all on this flattish land, really. The winemaker here is a very talented guy called Jorge Bombín. He's been making the wines there since 2008. This is 100% Tinto Fino, which is the same grape, obviously, as Tempranillo. It's just a synonym. Some people call it Tinto del País. And we'll tell you off if you call it Tinto Fino or Tempranillo, but anyway, it doesn't matter. We know what the grape is. He's using natural yeast. He's using old wood. He's using 500 liters. Again, we got this 2016 vintage again, so this cooler vintage. Quite big, as Luis said, in terms of crop size. So as long as people kept the crop, remember what I said earlier about Tempranillo and yield, as long as the yield was comparatively low, people made some really exciting wines. So this is Ligares. The first vintage of these Palomar wines was in 2014, and Jorge Bombín describes this as an extreme wine from an extreme region, and you can see what he means in a way. They're also, if you want to keep an eye out for them, they do 4 village-specific Palomar wines as well in this part of this range, if you like. One from Alcubilla de Avellaneda, one from La Aguilera, one from Moradillo, which is what we're tasting part of here, and one from Olmedillo. So let's taste the wine. So older oak, this is very much, if you like, the kind of new Ribera. Again, freshness, that slight peppery character. I think sometimes it uses a little bit of a whole bunch in this wine, and also chalk. The Palomos, what's interesting about them is that they tend to have a higher percentage of chalk. The whole of central Spain was underwater historically, and I think the higher you go, you get these deposits of limestone up on the top of the hills. You often find with these wines that you get that slight yeah, that's like chalkiness. Somebody said bit tired. Mine's fine. I'm hoping everybody's got a decent one. There we go. It's hilarious. Somebody said reductive and somebody's a bit tired. So you can't win, really, can you? I think this wine is usually fantastic. I hope some of you have a good sample of the wine in question. We're going to move on now to another Ribera, and this is Conde De San Cristobal. This is interesting. This is 2018, which was a warmer vintage. And this is a wine which is partly made by Javier Alsace, I mentioned earlier. Javier makes his own wine in Ribera del Duero called Alsace, easy to remember. And he was the winemaker, long-term winemaker at Vega Sicilia, which is with Pingus, obviously the most famous producer in the region. He's a consultant to Marqués de Vargas in Rioja, also to Conde de San Cristobal, and this was the first vintage 2018 in which he was involved. This is interesting here because these guys are based not very far indeed from Vega Sicilia, in Valladolid. Valladolid is in what they call the Valladolid bit of Ribera del Duero, includes what they call the Golden Mile. The Golden Mile, I think it's a kind of Las Vegas term, isn't it? The Golden Mile really doesn't refer so much to the vineyards as to the fact that the wineries are there. Vega Sicilia is there, although most of its vineyards are there too. But Pingus, for example, the winery building, such as they are, is actually in the Golden Mile or close to the Golden Mile. But most of its grapes come from other places, particularly, obviously, famously for La Hora. And what's important here, if you're in this warmer bit of Ribera del Duero, it's close to the river. I talked about 760 meters right on the riverside, is to have north-facing vineyards. If you go to Vega Sicilia, most of their best vineyards are on the south side of the river. That's to say they face north. So this is a comparatively warm bit of Ribera. It's the lowest bit of Ribera. The river Duero basically flows from the east to the west. It obviously goes into the Atlantic close to Porto in Portugal, but it's basically, as it's flowing from the east to the west, it's obviously as rivers do, it's basically going downhill. And so basically the more you move towards the west in Ribera as a general rule, the lower you go. But remember that Ribera is a river valley. So on both sides of the river, you have higher parts, really. The closer you are to the river itself, the lower the vineyards are. Here, we're at about 800 to sort of 900 meters. This is a single estate wine. You might be thinking, well, aren't all wines single estate wines in Rioja and Ribera? No, they're not really. I mean, a lot of Riojas obviously are blended across the region, or vineyards within regions, or even within villages. A lot of Ribera's most famous wines, like Alto, like Alion, like Garmon, these are all wines that are blended across the region. People are using different parcels within the three sub-regions, really, the three provinces, to make different styles of wines. So Soria, Burgos, and Valladolid. There is a little bit also in Segovia, but it's so small that it's not really worth worrying about. That's the fourth province. Okay, so this is now, it's 14 plots, 7 different soil types. And again, it includes 2 things. One, as I said earlier, was north-facing. Remember, we're on the south side of the river. This is the Pago del Valdestremero, which is on the south side of the river. And again, there is an element of Páramo. So again, these vineyards up on the top of the slopes with these calcareous clay soils. Again, this is 100% Tinto Fino, or Tinto del País, or Tempranillo, 12 months in French oak, of which 33% is new. So let's try this. This is so it's basically, it's a Golden Mile wine that isn't a Golden Mile wine in some ways. What has Javier brought to the wines? Well, I think greater freshness, a subtler use of oak. He's just a very, very smart winemaker and a very smart blender. If you get the chance to try his own wine, it's an interesting contrast, as I said, because he doesn't own vineyards. He's making a pan-regional style, learning what he learned when he was at Vega Sicilia, basically to use grapes, particularly Tempranillo, from different areas within the region. It is permitted, and I'm sure many of you know this, to actually blend in a little bit of Albio. which is a white grape variety. You can also use other things such as Garnacha and Bourbal and Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, but only in a restricted percentage. I think the maximum is 15%. That 85% of any Ribera del Duero red needs to be Tempranillo. Okay, the winemaker alongside Javier Alsas, who is the consultant, is Jorge Peuque, just in case he's watching. It would be nice to have a little word from him. But I think that's an interesting contrast, I think. So you've basically got one wine, which is purely a Palomar wine, using vineyards over 900 plus meters, yeah, from different sectors within the region. You've got another, which is an estate wine with north-facing and Palomar components within it. It's interesting talking about Ribera. Whenever I do tastings of Ribera, people say it all tastes the same, and I don't think it does taste the same. I think Ribera is very diverse. It's just a question of getting to understand it and getting to know it, really. And the best way to do that is to go there. It was always. Brad, there we go. Is Cabernet being elbowed out? Not really elbowed out so much. I mean, you know, it's obviously, it's a part of, important part of Vega Sicilia. It's been grown in the region since the 1850s. I think the interesting thing about Cabernet in Ribera is that it's an own-up grape that people, you know, the Consejo Regulador permit it. In Rioja, it's still what we call an experimental grape, despite the fact that it's planted at Baron de Ley. You know, Murieta obviously have it for Dalmau and other people too. It's still experimental, and if you often see Rioja technical sheets, it will say, you know, 90% Tempranillo plus 10% others, and the others might include Cabernet Sauvignon or Tempranillo, sorry, or Merlot, or even Syrah in some cases, all of which are permitted, but they're experimental in a sense. It's a bit ridiculous, really, that a grape variety that's been in a region since probably the 1860s is still considered experimental, but there you go. Okay, so those were the two Riojas and the two Riberas, and I wanted to do those together to make way for these two other wines at the end, partly because these two are older, and I took the decision in the end to put the wine from Cigales last of all, because it had 100% new oak, and I thought it was the biggest wine in some ways. So first of all, the Ochoa wine. We're in Navarra. We know where Navarra is. It's to the sort of northeast, really, of Rioja, and it's closer to the Pyrenees. And you know, there are 5 sub-regions, but basically the closer you go to the Pyrenees, the 3 northern regions, Val di Zarbi, Baja Montaña, in other words, under the mountain, a bit like Son Sierra, and Tierra Estella, you get more of this Pyrenean influence. Here, we're in the middle of the DO, basically in Ribera Alta, and if you go further south to the Baja Montaña, then you basically find that they're much warmer, basically. Okay, so we are on sand and ferrous clay soils. What's interesting here is that Navarra has about 11,000 hectares, and 35% of this is Tempranillo. Historically, Garnacha was known for its rosé wines in the same way that Cigales was. That people often said, even when I started writing about wine, that Rioja was red. Ribera was just being, you know, established, really, that 82 was the DO, that Navarra was pink, was rosé, and Penedès was white, and that's obviously changed now that people are growing all sorts of things in different places. So Garnacha again has lost out to Tempranillo, just as it has done in Rioja. The area, I love the area, it's beautiful. You know, it's best known obviously for the running of the bulls, San Fermin. I've never been brave enough to do that, but if you're feeling brave and COVID is over by this time next year, 7th to the 14th of July, you feel like running with the bulls or even watching other people do it. This is a really interesting winery. The Ochoa, as many of you will know, have a long history as grape growers going back 160 years. But Javier Ochoa, when I first got to know him, was the director of enology at Erena, and Erena was a local research station, really, and he was there from 1981 to 1992, doing lots of really interesting research into which grape varieties work best in which sub-regions of Navarra. He was a very pioneering winemaker, and still is, really, and has passed that on to his daughter, Adriana. Adriana is now the winemaker, and she's the 6th generation. So the winery Ochoa, even though the family has a long history in the region, began as a winery in 1994. They're medium-sized producer, 145 hectares. Most of their vineyards are in the Ribera Alta subzone, as I said, in the center of the region, in a place called near Olite, in a place called Traibuenas. Soils, sand, not a lot of limestone here, but ferrous clay, right? Those red soils that you often see in those iron influenced vineyards. We're lower in altitude here. We're at about 400 meters. So these are, in terms of altitude of the wines we've tried so far, this would be the lowest vineyard. It would probably also be the warmest. It's also our first blend. 55% Tempranillo with 30 Cabernet and 15 Merlot from 3 separate plots. If you're interested, these are called El Secadero, La Milla, and Montijo. This is named after Javier Ochoa, who is the paterfamilias, as I said. And these, according to him at least, are the best grapes of each harvest. 2012 vintage, 11 and 12 in Spain were both Mediterranean vintages. They were hot vintages. They were both drought vintages. Many people said that they learned from 11 in 12. In other words, that they've been through 11 and therefore they knew what to expect in 12. And I think there's an element of truth in that a lot of people made better 12s than they did 11 just because they've been sort of vaccinated against it, if you like, against the heat. Sapping this wine, someone's liking this. There we go. There we go. Is this a bit more Bordelais in style? It depends what you mean by Bordeaux, I suppose. But I think, remember, we're in one of the warmer bits of Navarra here. We're also in a vintage 2012, which is a hot vintage, which is a Mediterranean vintage, and yet the freshness and balance that's been preserved in this wine, I personally think is pretty remarkable. I really like. I mean, they're a very good team, really, in that the dad is one of those dads who, it's not always the case, has managed to pass on to the next generation. In this case, his daughter. Without interfering too much. I think he's a very smart guy, he's a very sensitive guy, and he's still involved in the winemaking, but it's pretty much her gig now. And I think Adriana is taking the winery in interesting new ways, and a lot of the wines, the less traditional wines, have more of her stamp on it. So she's working with different methods of fermentation, combining different grape varieties, using tinajas, using cement eggs, various things like that. So she's sort of one of the cutting edge winemakers, I would say, of Navarra. I really like this wine. And I think what's interesting about it, I mean, most of my favorite wines in Navarra tend to be high altitude garnachas, but I really like the blend. I think this is a very sensitively done blend. Anybody else has any comments? Jorge is not available today. That's a shame. But anyway, there we go. Info sheet. We've got the thing. You'll see more examples. Co-fermenting. That's a very interesting question. I think someone's just asking a question. I should go back and answer this question about white grapes. Historically, in all over Spain and in the world generally, people planted white grapes in red vineyards. And if you look at wines that that Jorge Monzón makes in Dominio del Águila, in La Aguilera, in Roberto Del Duero, he uses everything that's in the vineyards, and that includes a high percentage of white grapes. I think he probably lies about the percentages because they're probably higher than he would declare. But these old vineyards had everything. They had Bobel, they had Jaén, they had Palomino, they had, Calagraño, they had Viura, they had everything, Muscat, Malvasia. These old vineyards very often had all those things. And whether people will consciously now plant white grapes or other red grapes in vineyards, I think they should, particularly in Ribera, which has this heat. These wines can be very powerful. I think a grape variety which does brilliantly there is Surprise Garnacha. The Garnacha, you can dry farm Garnacha. It doesn't need to be irrigated. It stands up to heat. It, even at high alcohol levels, has comparatively low pH levels. It has more acidity and lower pH than Tempranillo does. So I think Garnacha is a very good blending grape variety. And in this case, I think what we're seeing here is Cabernet and Merlot. Anyway, on to the final wine, which is Cigales. Cigales, I'm afraid, is the one region here that I've actually not been to. I'm ashamed to say. It's very close to Ribera. It's sort of northwest of Ribera and sort of northeast, if you like, of Valladolid on the road to Burgos. And this is a region which historically was famous for a style called clarete. Clarete was co-fermented red and white grapes, and you also saw clarete is often produced historically in the southern part of Rioja Alta. The southern part of Rioja Alta, which is in the foothills of the Sierra de la Demanda, which is the southern border of Rioja. A lot of these vineyards faced north, and they were too cold historically, also because of their altitude, to produce red grapes reliably or produce red wines reliably every vintage. So again, clarete was what they made, usually often fermenting biur, co-fermenting biura with garnacha. What we're now seeing is that these clarete areas are becoming a little bit too warm for clarete. Obviously, Côte de Provence has kind of taken over the rosé market along with other people, and it's getting a bit harder, I would say, for Spanish rosados to make their presence felt, and a lot of people are therefore moving towards reds. This is quite a young area, Cigales. It has to be 85% Tempranillo or Tinta del País. The DO is recent, 1991. Remember that Ribera was 1982. And vineyards for this particular wine between about 700 and 880 meters. So Cigales is a bit lower than the higher bits of Ribera. The highest bits of Ribera would be now over 1,000 meters. And most of those are in the eastern part of Ribera in an area called Soria. And Soria is right out to the east, in fact, close to the origin, really, of the Duero River. This is from a producer called Finca Museum, or Museum, I suppose, which is owned by the Barón de Ley Group. The Barón de Ley Group is a very important producer in Rioja. It also owns El Coto, which is a famous brand. They own 198 hectares of their own vineyards, and these are mostly stony vineyards, gravel, sand, some limestone, and a lot of their vineyards, I was reading earlier today, are on the site of a former lake, but a long time ago. So I don't know whether there's any salt influence there, I'm not sure, or just whether a degree of limestone. 80% Tinta del País, dry farmed, bush vines, all of which are over 70 years, and this is 20 months in new French oak. I want to show this one last, just because I thought the oak was probably the most prominent of any of the wines here. I quite like it. Again, I think what's underneath it is really lovely. The freshness, the balance, again showing the brighter side, if you like, of the personality of Tempranillo. So we've basically done 6 wines. We could have done a Toro, and if we'd done 7 wines, then I would have included a Toro, because I think really that's the most obvious thing that we're missing. I mean, I suppose I could have done a Valdepeñas or something from La Mancha. Obviously, there are lots and lots of different styles of Tempranillo. But I wanted to show you something, as I said at the beginning with this carbonic maceration style, and that's a pretty serious carbonic maceration style. If you want something lighter, look at something like the Artuque wine, their basic wine. They're in Baños de Rio Ebro, and they make a much lighter style, if you like. Then we went on to the 202, which was very much this Alabasa style, and the pair of Riberas, all from Paramo, one from Paramo and north facing, again, fortunate in that they're dealing with these climate change vintages increasingly, although not in 2016. Then we had the blend. Is Tempranillo better with other grape varieties? I'll leave you to decide the answer to that, but I think very often in Rioja the answer is yes. I think a lot of my favorite Riojas include Mazuelo, Garnacha, and/or Graciano, or a combination of those, and I think that those give the wines greater longevity. And last but not least, we finished with a Cigales. I was told to do this in an hour, and I've managed to do it in 59 minutes and 32 seconds or something, so we've just about done it. If there are any other questions, I can just say, Simon, yeah, it's too further south. I think without altitude, the answer is yes. You know, I think that you need, you know, the thing about the meseta in Castilla-La Mancha is you have diurnal variation. and the diurnal variation is very important. I think that in Eastern Rioja, Tempranillo, frankly, is really exciting. I think it's often okay, but the high, you need to go high. And the highest bits of Rioja Oriental, as it's called, Eastern Rioja, in places like the Monte Yerga. Yes, you could grow Tempranillo there because you're at 700, 800 meters. But why grow Tempranillo per se when you could Garnacha, which I think is better suited to it. Lastly, retreat. More La Mancha. Yes, I would say that, again, fine with diurnal variation. You'd have to be picking pretty early. I think Tempranillo is good. But as a general rule, I would say not great. I think that the great areas for me tend to be ones at altitude with diurnal variation and often with clay and limestone soils. But that's only my opinion and doesn't have to be shared by anybody. And I'm sure there are as many different exceptions to the rule as there are things that conform to the rule. Any other questions before we go? Excellent, Tasty. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for tuning in. If anybody has any questions, I think we've probably done them all. Celine, 3 o'clock, over to you. Does anybody else want to say goodbye? No? There we go. Luis, nice to see you, Luis. It's lovely to have you in. I really like your wines. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in Rioja. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everybody.
Looking forward.
Sorry?
Looking forward, my friend.
Looking forward to it. Fantastic. I'll see you soon. Okay. Un abrazo. See you, everybody, and happy Tempranillo Day. No, it's not Tempranillo Day, but it is today.
Great job.
De nada. Un abrazo a todos.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.